like to introduce Andrew Hudson as our moderator. He is an international human rights lawyer with 20 years of experience and the executive director of Crisis Action. And you can learn more about him on Skoll.org. Have a wonderful session.
Great, thanks. Wonderful to see everyone here. Thanks so much for coming. So I'm going to add just a couple more house rules. The first is a really important one. I'm so excited that we have all of these panelists here. But Emmily Koiti has come to us from South Sudan. She spent months to get a visa. She's actually missing out on peace talks on South Sudan to be here with us. And her security situation is really precarious. So this is not being filmed. Please do tweet. I think the three of us don't mind what you tweet about us. But when Emily's talking about South Sudan, I just ask you to use your discretion, right? Just be a little bit careful. Just think about may it put her security at risk. So that's on that point. Please also think about the questions and comments that you want to ask throughout the panel. We want to make this as interactive as possible. I'm your advocate, is what Skoll told me. So I'm the audience's advocate. So I will definitely make sure that we wrap up by around 10:40, so that we've got lots of time for questions and comments and interaction. So why is this topic important? Why do we care about human rights impact evaluation? So I think why it's important at the moment is all of the social problems that we're trying to face, that each of us in this room are trying to solve, are more complex than ever and require networked solutions, require collaboration and require coalitions. So I think what we're seeing is any of these big problems, we all need to come together. Human rights problems are really hard to quantify. They're hard to measure, and that means that they can be hard to evaluate and measure. It's even harder when you're working with those coalitions and the multiplicity of actors. I think these are the kind of trends that we're seeing broadly. Then you also have donors, governments, the media, the public, that are requiring even clearer solutions, even simpler solutions, even easier and more quantifiable measurement of impact. Everyone wants to see easy, linear lines to impact. So that's why I think this session is really important. So I'm just going to do a quick audience poll, and then we're going to get stuck straight into it. But if we think about measurement, evaluation, would you rate yourself a beginner or advanced? So we're going to put our hands up first for beginner and then advanced. So this is around whether you think that you have an advanced knowledge of this topic. Who's a beginner? It's okay, right? Who's advanced? It's okay to be advanced as well. Good, great, okay. And then in terms of why did you come here? Did you come here because you want, oh yes, that's helpful, sorry. Did you come here because you want clear solutions? Or did you come here because you wanted to explore the topic and hear more and discuss? So, clear solutions first, hands up. A couple. Who wants to come here to discuss and write? That's very helpful. Good, all right, so it's going well so far. Okay, so, Alex, let's start with you. You are I think have greater expertise on this topic of impact evaluation potentially than the rest of us. So perhaps we can put Alex's critical framework up there, and it'd be great if you can start. And I don't think you need to stand up.
However,
oh please, yeah, absolutely. But what I would love to ask you, I know this first circle is the most important to you, and you say that we always skip over that. So can you tell us why this first step why is the why so important?
Sure. I mean, just briefly, look. Good morning, and thank you for being here. This is the most important topic there is, right? Full stop. So thank you for being here. You made a good decision. And why is it important? It's important for two reasons. Firstly, because this is of practical importance. Because if you do not have robust evidence about your performance, you cannot run a good social enterprise or social business. So you've got to have that for operational, and there's a moral reason. If you don't account for your impact properly, you have no right to call yourself a social anything. So it's a really important topic. But it's hard, right? It's hard, it's expensive, it's difficult. And so that's, to answer your question, I won't be too much of an academic and just talk whatever, it's hard. So where do you begin? And often people begin with a question that's the end of this list here, which is how to measure. So there is perhaps an understandable obsession about method. What's the right algorithm, the right equation, the right structure to capture some kind of truth in the impact of our activities? And I think that's really important, but that's the wrong question to be asking if you really want to make this work. So what this says, and you've got a copy in front of you for reference if it's useful to you, is a framework of questions that we have established over 10 years of work in this area to try to help you decide how. So to your question, why do we begin with why? Because the strategic purpose of your measurement has to be clearly understood by you before you begin worrying about any of the other questions. So, and what might that look like? And there's at least 2 or 3 reasons that might be the answer to the question why. You might want to know your impact in order to organise your activities better, to allocate your resources, to decide which programs work and which don't, to establish a hierarchy of effects. You might also need an external set of data to please your funders or governments or other organisations you work with. And you might also want to provide benchmarking data that can be used by other people in your sector to help organise their activities better, so they know what constitutes good and bad practice. So there's at least those three things that you have to ask to begin with, because each of those will lead to different other questions you then have to ask yourself, and ultimately will lead to different methodologies and different data sets and different ways of collecting data. So be clear about your strategy first is the answer to the why question.
Great, thanks Alex. I love the fact that Alex injured his leg very badly only a couple of days ago, so it's great that you're
such a hero.
So talk us through the for who. What does the for who are these people?
Well, so once you ask yourself the question why and answered it hopefully strategically, the truth is it might be more than one answer, because often you're trying to appeal to several strategic objectives. Then you're going to ask yourself, who cares about the data? So the data is for whom? Which audience? Because different audiences will want different data, and they'll want it for different reasons. So again, you kind of need a hierarchy of your stakeholders or your audiences for your evidence to begin to understand which are more strategically important to you. What's the hierarchy? Because they'll want to know different things. And indeed, for some, good performance might be bad performance for others. So you need to understand that. So you have to kind of do an audit of who are the audiences and what is their strategic importance to me with respect to that why question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So you stop me if this makes sense. Stop me if this is wrong.
No, it's good, it's good. Okay, why don't you, if you can quickly run through the last 3 circles,
sure.
that'd be great.
We'll be quick. All right, so for me, the one that really matters here is who measures. So this is to the theme of this entire conference about proximity, because I'm going to propose to you, and we'll see what my esteemed colleagues think in the real world, not in the ivory tower that I sit in. If you want really good data, you have to be close to your beneficiaries, customers, target client groups, if you will. And my argument to you would be they need to be deeply baked into your planning around impact measurement, and they need to be deeply involved in providing you and helping you collect data. Because they're the people who know, right? You sitting out there now, some of you will be thinking, when's he going to stop? I think I'm doing brilliantly at the moment because I'm standing up with a crutch, but you may not. So I need to let you tell me what my impact currently is. I need to be close to the people who supposedly I'm working with. So that proximity to your frontline clients, if you will, is really critical in moving on down this kind of linear model. That will let you establish what, because when you talk to your clients or beneficiaries, they'll tell you what matters to them. They'll tell you the changes that really are important to them, and you'll be able to map your activities against them and create data sets. And then you'll also learn from them when to measure, because measuring, say, once a week against once a month against once a year will often produce very different outcomes in human rights or social welfare issues. So you measure at the wrong point in time, you get the wrong data. It gives you the wrong message. It doesn't tell you your real performance. And then, and only then, Then you get to the how to measure. And the good news is that's the easy bit, believe it or not. We've had 50 years, more than 50 years, of work on how do we collect robust data on social and environmental impact. That's not hard to do. You can take it off the shelf, or you can adapt what's already there. It's robust, it's well evidenced, it's tried and tested. But there's a lot of different choices. That's why you have to ask these other questions to help you decide where you go when you come to how.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. That's really wonderful. Thanks very much. It's a great way for us to contextualise the topic and have a bit of a framework. So, yeah, great. Maybe, could we go to the other slide as well so people can see who Peggy is? So, Peggy, wonderful to have you here. Peggy and I have known each other for a long time. Peggy used to work at Human Rights Watch and is now at the UN Human Rights Office and a real legend in the human rights movement. I used the word doyen the other day, but you didn't seem to like it. So well, let's go with legend. So Peggy, can you tell, why is impact measurement hard in the human rights world?
Well, Alex just told me it wasn't, so I'm a bit confused. But we agree entirely with his bottom line about measuring close to the ground. And I think part of why it's been hard is because I don't think that that's been advice that's been followed by those who expect us to do impact measurement on the human rights side. But I gave some thought to what are the challenges from measuring human rights as opposed to other types of social impact. And I came up with a little framework that I had a hard time finding a good acronym for, and I ended up with Martin. Okay, the name Martin. So the first is measurability. Some of the things that we're measuring are some of the more difficult things. I take Alex's point that you can still measure them, but qualitative changes rather than quantitative changes or delivery of goods or services or something of that sort. So measurability is difficult. The A is for attribution. Almost every human rights endeavor is a multiplicity of actors involved, so figuring out who engages in it is difficult. I think one thing that makes human rights impact measurement difficult is risk. The problem is not everybody in that equation can really talk about what's happening and engage with us. So yes, we want to be proximate, we want to engage with beneficiaries, but sometimes they simply are not able to tell us what we need to know, and we're not able to be there in that way that we know is important. The next would be the T for the time frame. We're often pushed to measure impact in time frames which simply don't work from a human rights standpoint. Even 1 year, a long-term horizon on a lot of our grant reporting is 2 years. Well, human rights change, as we all know, often does not fit that time scale. Okay, so the I is a bit of a reach. But I use the word inference to make the I work. But basically, I thought about this, and part of why human rights measurement is difficult is a lot of times what we need to do is prove the negative. We're not proving what we've achieved, but what we've stopped from happening. Mm-hmm. And the more we are now within the UN, at least, looking at a prevention framework, where we're talking about we want to prevent conflict, we want to engage in different ways. A lot of what we do is about deterrence, for example, of member state or state actors on things. We have a new mandate that we're working on reprisals. So actions taken by governments against people who contribute to the human rights system. When our independent experts go and interview somebody, and then later that person gets arrested by the government for having cooperated with the UN, that's a reprisal. Our focal point on reprisals is wonderful gentleman, Andrew Gilmore in New York, who was talking with us about how frustrated he feels that he's not having impact, because the individual cases on which he's engaged, we haven't gotten anybody released. We haven't gotten a government to say, yes, we were wrong and we're not going to do that again. But what I tried to convey to him, and what I think we need to measure, is not just what happens in the individual cases that he's engaged in, but all the additional people who might have gotten arrested if we hadn't engaged on that case. And then even beyond that particular context, all the other moderate states who might be looking at that and saying, oh, we might have been tempted to do that, but we don't want to fall into the category of, for example, Egypt, who we made a big pronouncement on in one of our sessions on reprisals. So that proving the negative, the inference that needs to be taken is very difficult. And then finally, the N is for nature, I put. But it's really the context. It's the idea that these are political decisions that are being made in sensitive circumstances where the types of ways that you figure out what is a causal relationship, a lot of times people just won't want to tell you or won't give you accurate information because they have vested political interests in not revealing it to you. So I think, that's a landscape of all the reasons why our challenge is difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. So you've got two frameworks. You've got Martin here, Peggy's framework, and you've got the handout that Alex gave you. Peggy, maybe you touched on it, but do you want to talk a little bit more about why it's hard when to measure the collective, right? When you've got coalitions and it's not just one actor, right? You're not just trying to measure the impact of what your office is doing, but maybe dozens of people.
Right. Well, all of the factors that I talked about are accelerated or exacerbated in a collective setting. The issue of trying to prove for donor purposes, for example, that you're an actor can lead people to have a difficult relationship with others in the ecosystem that's made the change, and trying to tease out who did what often becomes quite challenging. So that competition for funding and for donor proof of engagement can make it difficult. There is, of course, there are, as Alex has said, there are very good tools that could help us really evaluate contribution, that we don't have to have accomplished everything. We just need to show our piece of it, our contribution. But I think some of those tools are quite difficult in terms of application and a little bit labor intensive. So the question is that cost benefit analysis worthwhile? And I'd posit that instead we should be looking up front about why the collective is needed, agree up front that the result couldn't have been achieved without the collective, and then really not spend a lot of time saying, whether somebody did 15% of the result compared to another person who did 20 or 25, but instead giving everybody engaged credit for the collective results achieved.
Yeah, great, thanks. Maybe we can just get the Twitter handles up again, because I want to make sure that everyone's tweeting Peggy's brilliance. And think about your questions, right? What do you think about this? We're going to get there, so don't lose your questions, write them down. So last question, Peggy. Let's unpack this idea of attribution versus contribution. Most people said they were beginners, so explain what does that mean. And I know you don't like attribution, so why don't you like attribution?
Well, the point is that we want to be able to encourage people to think of contributory efforts to get to a human rights result, because I simply can't think of any result that I've been engaged in a 25-year career that hasn't been a group of actors, and those groups work more effectively in achieving results more quickly in any case. So if we focus on attribution, then we spend a lot of time breaking down those pieces of who's done what, as opposed to contribution, which means all we have to prove is that the result happened and that each of us were part of that result.
Brilliant. So let's get more proximate to the problem. So Emily, it's fantastic that we have you here. This has been, I think, a great sort of theoretical start, but let's really get into a case study to really talk about human rights issues in South Sudan. And I think this is, it's obviously really, really important, and it shows the difficulties that Peggy's just been talking about in terms of how do you measure qualitative change. Emily, can you start by telling us briefly what is the work that you're doing to try and bring peace to South Sudan?
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. Andrew. I keep confusing the two.
We look the same.
Better looking.
So in South Sudan, I'm involved in the peace process. Currently, we've gone back to the table. We are having peace talks because we could not implement the agreement that we signed in 2015. And so in the peace negotiations, I'm there as a representative of the youth of South Sudan. But also, during the time we've been trying to implement the agreement that we signed, I serve on the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission that oversees the implementation of the agreement. And I also work with civil society coalitions in this engagement in the peace process or peace work, besides my being a medical doctor?
Yeah, it's really... it's really incredible what you've achieved, Emily. And Emily actually has her signature on the ceasefire agreement that the parties agreed at the end of December. So representing the youth of South Sudanese in these peace talks, it's incredibly impressive. So can you talk us about how do you work with some of these coalitions, with these groups of people? Yeah, talk us through some of the coalitions that you're working with and what that looks like.
So in South Sudan we have coalitions that, of course, coalitions are formed around issues, but in relation to in regards to peace, how we work with them is they consult the people on the issues that arise as we are discussing in the peace process, then get the feedback to us so that then we develop context-specific positions based on what is collected from the people, and also information is taken back from us on what are the difficulties, what are the deadlocks we are facing, and what are basically the citizens saying on the ground. For example, if the government walks out of the peace talks, the citizens are they want to know who is against peace. So then we would get to know that one of the indicators to the citizens in regards to who is against attainment of peace in South Sudan would be walking out of one party out of the peace talks, or if it's one of the opposition groups or a coalition of opposition groups. So that's how we basically work in a nutshell when it comes to the peace process.
Yeah, great. And what I know there've been so many challenges. What challenges have you faced trying to work collaboratively with these different coalitions, with these different groups of people in a country that is so divided and so polarized? How do you bring coalitions together?
So South Sudan, we have the ethnic tensions, and that has a lot to do with the conflict we've had that is still ongoing. And even in these coalitions, you'll find different civil society organizations and youth organizations and women's organizations struggling with the reflection of diversity, the diversity of our ethnicity in South Sudan. And that in itself is a challenge. It's in a challenge in the sense that whatever the coalitions come up with, as long as they've not reflected the diversity of the South Sudanese ethnicities in their composition, that alone questions the legitimacy of their views or the positions they come up with. That's how bad ethnicity has affected us in this process. You would think that just because we are practitioners and we are good at what we do, regardless of where we come from, we should be able to influence the process without the legitimacy of the positions being questioned. But that happens. And also, talking about attribution, in coalitions you'll find that the one I work with is a civil society coalition, which is a coalition of coalitions. Because in there are youth coalitions, which is the the constituents I represent, and then there are women's coalition. I'm also a woman, I participate in that. Then there's the broader civil society coalition under which all these fall. And so they struggle. You'll find that the workers are few. These are over 200 civil society organizations. But then those who make things happen are very few. By the end of the day, they have to share the gains with everybody else who had nothing to do with the hard work. And so there's going to be struggle between, people are going to struggle doing their own organization's work because they have to report to donors, and then the work that they have to do within a coalition. So then they have to choose, unless they really are passionate about what they are doing, and theirs was a primary intention to get involved and have impact on the process.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Emily. One of the great things about Skoll.org Forum is it's inspiring stories of change, right? And Emily, I think, we've worked really hard, Emily in Crisis Action and Skoll, to get Emily here. So I hope you're feeling this, that there is inspiring hope even in a country like South Sudan. So can you tell us about the impact of the work that you've done? I mean, you've achieved some amazing things, Emily. Give us a flavour of what you've managed to achieve.
Quite a number of things. I want to be polite about them, but all this couldn't have been possible, again, without working with coalitions. Just me simply being there in the process, or any of the other delegates who represent the non-political stakeholders wouldn't have made it if the coalitions did not galvanize their efforts or positions in the process. So one thing we have achieved is that more than unlike any other peace process we've had, because we had one that gave us the CPA that made us eventually become an independent country, the newest on earth. And what we've got is that now we have more representation of civil society at the table than before. There are more women as negotiators than before. We've pushed for women to be represented in the political parties, and that is one of our achievements as civil society, because nobody would have said it. We said if a party is asked to have three delegates, one of them must be a woman. We also told IGAD, which is the mediator, that one of the facilitators, if you get three of them, one of them has to be a woman. And we are glad that the former foreign minister of Ghana, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Ghana, is one of the facilitators, Her Excellency Hannah Tete. And then we've also, when you look at the rest of us who are non-political stakeholders, there are more. There's academia, there's a woman from academia, there's myself. I'm glad that we undo this whole notion that a young person must be a male somehow. So I'm a woman at the table in the representing the youth. And then we've also influenced the content of the agreement substantially. The parties are there to divide the cake. That's all their business. They really don't care about things changing for the better. If there is any provision that we have to include and they know that somehow it's going to infringe on their abilities to loot the state, to mismanage the state, we struggle to put that in, but somehow we have to get it inside there, because that reflects the aspirations of the citizens who we interact with every day, who we are in proximity with, talking about proximity. And we've also ensured that parties remain focused, because they engaged in war, they lost all of us. They focused on winning the war and lost the nation. And today, for them, they are still thinking that it's possible to win militarily. But then we remind them that we got the country we have today because somehow, even after fighting for 21 years, it all had to end at a table, dialogue. And we have to constantly remind them with that. When they are power hungry, they forget all that history. And for them, it's about winning the war and continuing whatever they want.
Yeah.
So for us, we are there, and we've constantly helped them to be able to get focused. But also, we've ensured that the pressure is built against them from those who wish us well.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And for those that came late, just take care when you're tweeting about Emily. So especially the arms embargo is a really sensitive topic in the peace negotiations, so I would suggest you don't tweet about that. Thanks, Emily. I mean, what I think is amazing about the work that you're doing is that we all know that peace agreements around the world are much more likely to stick if women are involved in the negotiations of those peace agreements. It almost never happens. In Yemen and Syria and elsewhere where there are peace talks, there are no civil society people in the room. We've managed to get not only civil society people in the room, as you said, Emily, but also women involved in these peace talks. And so, Emily's sitting across the table from the President's chief negotiator in the same room, discussing how to bring peace to the country. So I think it's a great case study. Get your questions ready, because we're coming to you in about 10 minutes. Peggy, what to put you on the spot? You're great. What lessons or points did you draw out of that case study of Emily's work in South Sudan in general to bring it back to the topic around your Martin framework or the challenges that we've been talking about in terms of impact and measurement?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example, and obviously amazing achievement that Emily and her colleagues have been involved in. For me, it illustrates one of the points I wanted to make is that when we talk about human rights impact measurement, there really is a spectrum, and there are some areas of it that are much easier to address than others. So, for my organization, for example, we do technical support, and we can, if that works, it's fairly easy to look at, whether a government has been able to get sort of the training and implement it in the way that we wanted. for Emily's example, when you look at the work that they've done, just getting that representation of women and others within the process, that's a very concrete achievable. And if we agree at the outset that achieving that does make a difference in peace processes, and I think there's an enormous amount of research that shows it does, then, you know, that's it. So that piece of it, you know, really easy. But then you heard Emily go on to say, and we've had a substantive influence in the negotiations. Now think about how difficult it would be to actually get good data on what has happened within those negotiations. The political actors are never going to say that having these people present made us actually do our jobs and listen to what the people on the ground need as opposed to what I want for my party and myself, right? So that political nature of the negotiations and sensitivity. When I worked at the aforementioned Human Rights Watch NGO, there were examples in peace processes where my colleagues were drafting provisions of peace negotiation documents that they would feed into actors that would then make their way into the document. Now, that would be a great thing to be able to tell a funder that, look, you know, that provision is there because we actually wrote it and contributed it in. But of course, if we were to do that, it would totally burn that chain of engagement for going forward and actually undermine the credibility, ultimately, of the language that was in the agreement, right? Because it would seem like it was outside influence as opposed to organic through the process, which I assure you it wasn't. It was through conversation, but there was assistance in that conversation in terms of making the outcome one that would stick based on lessons learned and experience from elsewhere, which is what our colleagues could bring in. So it's those sensitivities and the political nature of the type of work that Emily does, which I think is a good case study in terms of how difficult this process can be.
Yeah, totally. And Emily and I were talking yesterday, and you were talking about the negotiations you're doing at the moment around is it power sharing or responsibility sharing? Mm-hmm. And that's huge in my idea. If you get the warring parties in the government to agree that it's not power sharing, it's responsibility sharing, that's really, really big. But trying to explain that maybe to a donor or others that that's impact, it might just look like semantics, right? So it can be really, really difficult. Alex, can I come back to you? Maybe we can get Alex's framework back up there for those that have arrived late. Or I guess you've all got copies, so it's fine, sorry. But what you've heard so far, how are we doing in the different circles?
Just tear it up, right? That's all wrong, I got it all. Just again, acknowledging the amazing work these people are doing, amazing. Well, I think when you have multi-systemic problems of this scale and this complexity, if you think about impact, you have to start breaking it down. I mean, you put your hands up earlier on saying many of you are quite advanced in this kind of activity. Hands up, how many of you work with some kind of theory of change model? Hands up, theory of change, logic model sometimes called. So that's how you begin, right? You say, well, we've got a model that says we have some inputs, we have some activities, they create outputs, some outcomes and some impact. Now, I guess in this area, you know, peace is an impact. That's a long way down the chain. So how do you begin to break this down? You say, well, you know, we know it's an organization or a coalition. We have some inputs, some stuff we bring together, and we have some stuff we do, and we can measure that collectively or separately. And from that, we can infer a bunch of stuff that can be relatively robustly assumed. I mean, the counterfactual stuff that you were talking about is impossibly difficult to work out in complex situations. You know, what would have happened if? It's really difficult. But you can still make inferences from, well, you know, if we bring more women into the process, there's reasonable evidence that might have a following outcomes. So, you know, you can work your way so far along a theory of change model with a certain amount of credibility, and ultimately it becomes harder and harder to be credible, I think, as you go along towards peace, claiming it for yourself. But I do think you can throw some structure around this that can create data and evidence for people. And then the big issue, really, if you're talking to funders or to government agencies, is to have a grown-up conversation with them about what evidence is good enough. And there's a really bizarre thing in this space where, you know, social entrepreneurs and social activists are often held to a level of accountability on standards of evidence way ahead of, say, governments, certainly ahead of financial institutions or corporations, most of whose data is very poor most of the time. And yet we expect, if you're in the social sector, you've got to really prove it, you know, demonstrate to me. So we need to have a grown-up conversation about what is good enough. And theory of change models can help you, I think, make some arguments about, well, we can definitely show you this, we can infer this, the rest, well, you know, we're on the way, but maybe we can't prove that.
Yeah, brilliant. Picking up, bringing you in on that last point, because I know you're passionate on it. You know, one of the great things at Skoll Forum is we do bring donors and grantees together, and there's a mix in this room. So on this donor point, you know, do donors sometimes have unrealistic expectations?
Well, that's easy. Yes. No, I think it's interesting. Alex and I didn't speak before, but how much what he just said parallels with what I think needs to happen. There needs to be an adult conversation up front about what the theory of change is, and if you would then achieve the things within that theory of change, then the results can be assumed or inferred to have resulted from the work that was done by the people that you're funding. Instead, we tend to have conversations that don't take account and don't link into all of those different factors that I outlined in the Martin framework. And each of those is relevant, and you have to take it into account if you really want to do human rights impact assessment in a credible way. The thing I'd really like funders to remember is that the current process, there's been a lot of effort to try to, through funders I know have tried to encourage coalitions and encourage people to work together. And so they've tried to build that into their funding models. But I still think there's a lot of work to be done there, because the reality is that that is sort of the stated principle of it, but it doesn't reflect some of those realities that Emily was just talking about how the work actually gets done within those coalitions, and whether those coalitions are really mutual, you know, actors of mutual interest who are there for the same reasons and for the same results. And I just think we need a more sophisticated view on that. And finally, that funders need to really keep in mind that this process has to fit with the realities of doing human rights work on the ground, and the requirements can't be so strenuous and so difficult that they actually, you know, supersede the work in some ways. The cost-benefit analysis has to be a real one, and you have to be very careful about stifling innovation and risk-taking by human rights groups. I see that all the time, that people on the ground are so worried about whether or not they're going to be able to show results that they take pathways that are the set ones, the ones that everybody expects you to take, as opposed to the innovative ones where they might really be able to achieve. My friend Nick Grano, who's in the back, we were having a conversation about this conference and the way that Skoll has approached bringing us all together. I mean, it's a huge investment of time. You know, I'm sure somebody out there is evaluating the impact of this and trying to assess it. But the reality is the connections that are being made in a conference like this between individuals and organizations and the work that comes out of them will never fully be able to be pulled together to see, you know, the relationship between the investment and the impact of this event. But I think you could get a really good sense of it by the fact that all of us are here and want to come back. And that means that we are getting a lot out of it, and that it is a meaningful contribution and an innovative one.
So you can play your part in the evaluation of the forum by filling these forms out. In previous years, they said if the session was rated poorly, we wouldn't get invited back. So I'm glad you've taken that out, but please rate us highly if you think that's right. Now, look, it's time to come over to you. There's heaps of expertise in this room, so let's get a lot of questions. We'll take them in rounds. Are we doing microphones? Or so let's go to Joy at the back up there, and guys, we'll take a couple of rounds, so we won't answer one by one.
Hi, thank you for the session. My name is Joy Olson. I've been the director of the Washington Office on Latin America, a human rights group. Works on Latin America, drug policy, organized crime, human rights related issues in that venue. I've been thinking a lot about this indicators issue, and the easiest thing to measure is always things you can count. And so we include them whether or not they, whether or not they fit on anybody's chart up there, because you can count them. But as the more I've been thinking about it, I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm thinking big thoughts. And the more I've been thinking about the things that I can count, some of the easy ones are social media and fundraising related, right? You can count dollars, you can count hits and retweets. But those things don't ever make us get outside of our own bubble, because the people who see our stuff are the people who are already interested in us or close to that sphere. And so it feels like to me, you can argue that I'm measuring the wrong things, but I think it's not just me. I think we all are measuring the wrong things because this is what we can measure. And I think that we're contributing, at least in the United States, to this level of polarization that exists. At least we're not doing much to counteract it. And so I wanted to hear what you think.
So let's take a couple of questions. There are some other hands. Can we go to the slide down here?
Hi, Alyssa from the Skoll Foundation. My question relates to something that Alex, you brought up and has been then reiterated in the panel so far, is that oftentimes we're very extractive in the way that we collect data. And I'm just wondering how you collect data that's important and insightful and takes all of that proximity into account while also not being exploitative.
Great, let's take one more. Is there anyone over here? So I'm being... We'll get there. We're going to get to everyone. So I see you all.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. Having worked in government funding, I'm very aware of the way the need for impact measurement gets in the way of impact. And I really liked the idea of having an adult conversation, but how does it actually happen? I guess that's the question. I mean, it's a great point, but how do we do it?
Great, okay, so we've got the indicators issue and how we measure. We've got, are we being extractive in collecting data, and how do we have the conversation with donors? Alex, do you want to kick off?
The second question briefly, is that okay? Well, first thing to say is that if we're getting more engaged data collection and data management and planning right, it in itself is empowering, not extractive. Because lots of the people that will present you that data are people whose opinions have never been asked for before. You know, they're at the end of some chain of welfare, or some chain of development, or some chain of even human rights possibly, and they don't necessarily get asked their opinion. So I think if you just doing it well to begin with is the opposite of what you say. But then how do you do it? Well, in our experience, what we've done are a few ways. And we have, I'll call him out, Joe Brilliant up there. We have technology increasingly coming to our aid through apps and mobile technology to get real-time information from the front line from people who have access to a telephone or connection. That's one way. We can organise people in solidarity groups or in community groups or cooperatives to have a voice. And we can design a range of other interventions to get people's honest opinion to us as people who need to know their opinion and act on that data. So it's not easy, but there are methods, and if it's done well, in itself it has this added value that it creates a social impact in itself on top of everything else you're doing, because often you empower people who have no voice normally, which is a powerful additional thing, I think.
So on those different points, on the quantitative point, Joy, I couldn't agree more, and it's part of, it's a real struggle, and it goes to the question about what's being asked. I do think that the conversation has to be one that, you know, sets indicators that challenge that type of outside engagement and doesn't, you know, focuses more on what we think will really matter and allows, you know, risk-taking and activities that may not achieve, you know, a straight line path to results as well. In terms of how you have that conversation, I think one of the main issues is flexibility. The problem is that we have set approaches to impact measurement that are applied across the spectrum of activities and contexts, which are incredibly different. And to build in some ability to recognize, you know, what is applicable where, and to have a conversation up front about the time and investment it will take to get impact measurement done in the way that the funder is expecting it to get done, and to have that conversation in a way that allows, I mean, at a point in the conversation where the person, the recipient of funding isn't at such a power disadvantage that they're going to say whatever the funder, you know, wants to hear in terms of what they're going to get. I mean, I've talked to relatively small, or in some contexts, relatively large NGOs who are very aware of these dynamics, yet don't bring them into their conversations because they feel like there just isn't the space to do it. So, create that opening, have some flexibility, and then, let's see it more as a partnership in achieving impact as opposed to a donor-funder relationship, which, I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I mean, if we work together on the theory of change, then you have an investment in it as well. Now, from the recipient side in the human rights context, there can be some risk there of not wanting to feel like your methodology and approach and your independence is being undermined by too close a relationship with the funder. But realistically, that sort of upfront engagement, I think, is crucial to getting us there. And on the issue of the way that we deal with people on the ground, I really liked what Alex had to say. And I do think that having those real conversations, my experience is people too want to be asked about whether or not, the work that's being done by organizations like mine matters to them. And we get both good and bad answers, and that's what we need to hear. But it's not done in a very effective or thorough way, and I think exactly with the technology that's now available, we should be able to improve on how it's being done.
Just taking my moderator's hat off for 1 second, we're going to come to it. I would say on impact measurement getting in the way of impact, if, as Peggy said, if you have that honest conversation, I can't ever imagine a donor saying to you that that's what they want to achieve, right? Of course they don't want to ever put anything on you that's going to get in the way of having impact. So I think having that honest conversation, but also being proactive, right? And what we do a lot of crisis action is proactively communicate with our donors before they're asking for impact measurement. And really, to Joy's point, not falling into the trap of measuring quantitatively stuff that's just useless, right? There's just no point doing that. And so we're fairly dogmatic at saying, look, these are complex issues. We need to be absolutely measuring our impact, but we need to be doing it qualitatively. And we want you to be able to work with us to understand that qualitative impact measurement is really important. So let's go around. So let's go to the gentleman at the back there.
Thanks so much. My name is Sasha Chanoff. I lead Refuge Point, an organization that finds lasting solutions for the world's most at-risk refugees and supports the humanitarian community to do the same. I want to just say a special thanks to Emily. I've been working with South Sudanese refugees for about 25 years now, and yours is the kind of voice we need to hear more and more across the world, so thank you for being here. The former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that millions are trapped, speaking of refugees, millions are trapped in dependency on short-term aid that keeps them alive but falls short of ensuring their safety, dignity, and ability to thrive and be self-reliant over the long term. We see today that there are more refugees than ever before, and the length of time someone's a refugee is about 20 years, and yet about $25 billion a year goes to short-term emergency aid year after year. I'm telling you a few things because I want to ask a question and get your input, although I don't know if there's an answer to it. The Sustainable Development Goals now include refugees, whereas the Millennium Development Goals did not. Refuge Point is helping to build and lead a coalition that includes IKEA Foundation, includes a lot of the leading humanitarian response organizations in the world to try to promote self-reliance for refugees so they don't have to depend on erratic aid and don't have to risk their lives in dangerous onward journeys. The question is, we need a paradigm shift from emergency response to a more sustainable way of supporting refugees. And that's there in the language and frameworks that are being created right now, but we're not seeing action on the ground. So as we think about this paradigm shift from emergency response to a paradigm of self-reliance, how should we think about measuring that? Is it from thinking about what kind of funding changes to go toward that? Is it thinking about impact on the ground? What are the different ways that you could consider measuring a paradigm shift towards self-reliance?
Great, thanks, Sasha. There was a woman here, I think I had a hand up just in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Mira Reimer. I'm from Bait of Hope, an NGO that's promoting, helping different NGOs in Israel and Palestine, working together on initiatives of dialogue, bridge building, and nonviolence. And I have a question for Emily about how do you deal with coalitions? How do you deal with the challenges of different sensitivities to encourage them to come together and have more impact?
Great, thank you. Yeah, let's go to the woman up the back there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Almaz Negash. I run the African Diaspora Network, but I want to speak on my position, a temporary position with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I'm on the high-level panel on migration, which is actually chaired by Serafin Johnson, the former president of
you will
Liberia.
Come to a question, right? There'll be a question at the end.
Excuse me. Let me ask you the question. The question is this. This panel ends soon. And my concern is, even though I am on the panel, what are we going to do and what would be the outcome? 1 million people are actually refugees right now in Uganda. What are we talking about and what can we do for them? Who is going to really support this huge and massive human the people that are actually languishing, some of them, but they're in better place in Uganda than they were before. If there is any insight from any one of you, I would be very, very appreciative of that.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to kick things off both with the question about coalitions, but also obviously given your experience on refugee issues as well, if you have any insights?
Of course, in coalitions there are many challenges that I cannot elaborate because of time. But some of the challenges, like we are learning. We've come a very long way in terms of working as coalitions. We did ahead of our referendum in 2011, and we learned a few things related to our ethnic diversity, also attribution, who gets the credit for the achievements of the coalition. But we've had to have honest conversations amongst ourselves, because much as I sit on the table, I work with a civil society organization, and that means I engage in the day-to-day activities of the coalitions. And we've had to have an honest conversation about what is it that we want to be known for collectively as a coalition for having achieved, and what is it that we would want individual organizations to be recognized for as the ones who did what we did, despite the fact that it's the entire coalition that was behind such an achievement. I think that has helped us address some issues to do with coalition. But again, we constantly have the challenge of when some organizations cannot maintain their funding sources, then they get out of the work they are doing, they cease to exist. Then you're talking of 200 organizations, but you're not able to track whether all of them still exist after 1 year in the coalition. Because some of them are simply followers. They like what is being done. They do not know exactly how things are supposed to be done, but they identify with the goal that the coalition is pursuing. But we are so lost in the things that we have to do, the goal that we have to achieve, and that we cannot look back and check who is still with us, So that in itself is a challenge. There are funding aspects to it when our colleagues get out, and then they have other challenges on the ground. There is all that. Some of them tag along because they are spying on us. We cannot also check that properly. It's a very risky environment because, again, in our context, working with coalition, it means you're disrupting the status quo. I saw something like that it means you're going to do the things that are very uncomfortable that everybody else is not willing to do. So again, we have to constantly seek for protection and sometimes put out certain faces, depending on the power analysis we will have done. There are colleagues amongst us who wield more power because of the relationship that they have with the parties. They worked with these people, and some parties cannot face certain individuals in civil society and say certain things because of the work that we have done since we began trying to forge the country that we have today. So there are all those dynamics. We have to do a power analysis, we have to check who is good at doing what, and then divide our roles as well. But still, there are those who we have to acknowledge the other challenge that there are those who are simply there because for them it's getting funding and ticking boxes. Unfortunately, that's a remnant of what some donors have left us with. And that's what some organizations have learned, that you do something to tick a box without necessarily caring about the impact. So there are also those, when we get a pool of funding, they will still want to be given money, even when they are not going to be able to do what we want to be achieved within the coalition. That's also there. The other challenge is, again, we tend to have honest conversations with donors. We are going to do this activity, but even as we will have done this, you will not appear anywhere on anything. And that's something that you have to accept.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
And if you're on Twitter, look at the hashtag South Sudan is watching, and you'll see some of the other innovative tactics that Emily's got up to. Peggy, did you want to come in on any of those ones?
Yeah, no, I want to pick up on the two questions that basically had a refugee-related component. I think Sasha's was the easier one because, as I heard it, you were asking not about how we achieve the paradigm shift, but how we measure how we're doing on the paradigm shift, as opposed to how are we going to solve the issues that are facing us in terms of the number of migrants and refugees that have to be addressed. It's interesting. I actually think, and maybe I'm being unduly optimistic, but some of those shifts are a bit easier to measure than some of the other changes. I use as an example work that we've done in terms of when we set objectives of sort of changing the way certain issues are looked at and injecting human rights as part of an understanding of an issue. So drug policy is an issue where we've tried to insert human rights as a relevant factor in terms of looking at how we engage on access to drugs and drug policy. We've actually been able to come up with better indicators, more easy to use indicators and analysis, because it does tend to be things that some of the quantitative stuff actually does make sense in that context. And I wonder if the paradigm shift that you're talking about, obviously you wouldn't be able to do it globally, but if you look at some influential actors and the approach and language that they're using, and if they make some of those shifts that are somewhat more quantifiable, that you're achieving some of those objectives. So I think it's the same tools, but potentially more usable in that situation.
And if I could just add on that point, Sasha, I think I would say look at the outcomes from donor conferences, right? So I think we're already starting to see that donor conferences are actually no longer just pledging money, but actually trying to also come up with some political solutions. And also looking at governments' humanitarian strategies. And again, I think what we're seeing there is where governments are going different directions, but some governments are realizing actually that humanitarian strategies can't just be purely band-aid solutions, that they do need to be getting a little bit more political. So I would just point to those 2 points. Let's go to a final.
Sure. Very quick. Just to also point to a couple of other innovations that are going on, and they're often put under the heading of payment by results models, which governments are looking at more and more. They're called pay for success models in the US. So what we're seeing is a major shift, and some of my colleagues in the School of Government say the most important shift in public welfare there is globally right now, which is governments moving away from buying outputs like putting so much money towards saving lives, important though that is, but to say we also need to look at beyond that, exactly as you're describing. What happens to people once we've got through an emergency moment in the longer term, and how can we think about that? Again, sometimes the language is a little unpalatable in a kind of cost-benefit way. So actually, if we help people establish themselves better in society, get a job, get a career, training, once they have been saved, then actually long-term it's better for the public finances, better for global finances. So having a longer-term view and calculating that in policy or donation spend is a big agenda that's happening right now.
I did want to say on that, of course, it brings into sharp contrast that issue of time scale, right? That if what you're working on is paradigm shift and you've got a 1 year to do it, we've got a problem. So Alex's point is very well taken that, if you can look at what are some of the pathways and some of the indicators that Andrew pointed out, it'd be important.
Great. Okay, so we've got, who wants to ask a question? Right, okay, we're not going to quite be able to get to all of you. Let's start over here with these two women, and we'll go over here.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. I'm Deirdre Cooper. I'm a partner at Ecofin, so I run a listed sustainable investing strategy. And I'm really interested in how we take the work that you're doing on impact reporting within social entrepreneurship and the nonprofit sector and leverage that data to engage with companies for those of us that are doing ESG work. So, you know, something we do a lot of is we look at the electric vehicle supply chain, and we have a big problem with cobalt and the Congo, but we find it really hard to find good data on where, in order to track who really is doing good work and engaging on, that's just one example of one topic, and who isn't. So how do we find a better way to take all the great work you were doing and use it for those of us who are running the equity strategies?
Thank you. My name is Bali Belchin, and I am at Tostan. We're an NGO who we work in thousands of villages in West Africa right now, but we've also been in Somalia and Djibouti. And we do work on many human rights issues and find that when you have social norms in place that are related to these human rights issues, they are very complex and very difficult to monitor and evaluate, which means that over the years, and we've been doing this for 27 years now, we have totally readapted how we evaluate whether a social norm is still in place or if it's evolving, where it is in terms of the evolution of whether it's changing or not. And I'm just wondering, Alex, you talked about it being easy to measure. Or we have lots of tools. But what we found is that that is a relatively new field, that there are very few people who are really working on measuring, evaluating social norm change. Just giving the example of female genital cutting, which we are known for, we totally do not measure now in the same way that we measured 5 years ago because of all of the, we're piloting ways of trying to do that to really figure out what's going on. So I just wondered if you have worked on that, or if you, Peggy, if you've worked on that also, if you have done work on measuring and evaluating social norm change.
Great. Let's take two final questions. So let's go to Oren and Federico. Sorry, we'll stay here though. We can speak afterwards. I know we didn't get to a couple of questions, and I made a promise about.
Hi, Oren. I'm running an organization called Videra. We give cameras to people in the press community, but actually I want to ask about something that I used to do for many years, working in Israel-Palestine conflict. And I want to ask something provocative and challenge you, thinking that us as civil society helping our own contain the problem than really solving it. And my claim will be that probably in Israel, if we break all civil society 20 years ago and to do any more, maybe we have a better solution now than where we are at the moment. So just want your view on it.
If you didn't have civil society, would they have been better off, basically? Civil
Yeah,
society
probably the peace process will move to a better place than it is really now.
Great, so we're just touching on Israel-Palestine, awesome.
Hi, my name is Federico. I work for Center for Civilians in Conflict, working on the protection of civilians in conflict zones. We've talked about practitioners and funders and the relationship. My question to Alex and other panelists is, what's the role of the movement of social entrepreneurship? It seems to me, being relatively new to this, that it's also very big on impact evaluation, understandably so. And because of Martin, what we heard, I fear that the kind of organizations like Emily's that do human rights in a deeply political space risk being marginalized here. In fact, when I look at the kind of organizations that are here, and I'm not talking about crisis action or civic or the big organization, but the local organizations, I don't see many of them here. So do you share my concern that there is a risk that this movement that really needs these groups, and these groups need this movement, risks marginalizing them, and what can this movement do to bring them back into the fold? Thank you.
Thanks, Federica. So we've got about 5 minutes left, so we have to be really brief. This is our final word. Emily, do you want to start?
Yes, I want to answer his question on the involvement of civil society. I want to say this without fear of contradiction, but no matter the challenges civil society faces, it must be at the table in the negotiation of any peace agreement. Because agreements only hold if we cultivate ownership by the citizenry for which those agreements are going to attain the peace that we want. And you begin attaining ownership by allowing their representatives to be at the table. The parties really often do not represent the citizens because after all, we get to that table because they forgot their responsibilities. The second thing is that agreements are now known to hold because we embrace the principle of inclusivity, where we ensure that everybody who is affected by whatever is the issue at the table is also involved in the talks. And in our case, it's the women bear the brunt of the war. The young people have been exploited because of their vulnerability, and they are at the front lines. We also have the business community. They are represented in the talks, in our peace talks, because their properties have been, their businesses have been destroyed. They also want to ensure that at some point there is reparation for that too. There are also foreign businesses, and those who represent the South Sudanese representatives for the businesses have to be even speaking for those foreign businesses, because then they have to correct the past that we have gone through that makes the investment climate in our country bad. It's correcting things that have gone bad. So I would say that there is no way talks can be better if civil society is not involved. The thing is, the parties are always going to say all weird things about the work of civil society, just so that civil society is not at the table. But agreements are only better if civil society is at the table. And it will never be said that civil society influenced, it's what Peggy was saying, it's never going to be said that this provision made its way into this agreement because civil society crafted the text of this agreement. You will not hear that being said. But most of the provisions that come out of the agreement, they do not come from the drafters. They come from civil society. They come from people who really care about those suffering citizens. They don't come from the parties, not even the mediators. In our case, it's the Intergovernmental Authority that is doing it, doing the mediation, and we know that that is a state actor dealing with a state actor. They cannot have the best interests of the people more than the non-political stakeholders at the table, who are the civil society. So I would still argue that it's important that we have civil society at the table.
Great, thanks, Emily. Alex?
Okay, 3 very quick points then. To the social entrepreneurship question, the good news is it's changed. In the 15 years I've been working on this, the political dimension has been recognised, thank goodness. We've been pushing that here at Oxford forever. And don't tweet this, but our hosts and my ultimate paymasters, the Skoll Foundation, completely changed their position on this about 8 or 9 years ago, from a position where they excluded any political action as part of what they call social entrepreneurship, as seeing it was integral in systems change. So that's hallelujah for that. So I think it's better understood. Molly, I've never worked on that particular topic. There are methodologies to try to track big cultural, cognitive change. They come out of the social movements literature largely, but briefly you can do it kind of long-term and big or short-term and local. But I'm happy to talk a bit about that, though I'm not an expert, I've done some of it. And it isn't easy. I should never have said it's easy. What I mean is the methodologies are there, applying them is difficult. But there are methods, but it's not easy. And the finance question, back, if I may be self-serving to where I began today, I think you have to understand what it is your investors actually need to know and why. And if they are asking for a cobalt, you have to have a conversation with them about what you can reliably inform them and what you can't to help investment decision making happen. And maybe offer them a suite of things that are of interest to them in terms of how they use their money.
Great. No, they're all such great questions. I'm sorry, we have to close. But for me, I mean, one point I wanted to make, and I think it fits with your question and also with Molly's, unfortunately, but in different ways. We haven't talked a lot about data and how data influences human rights impact measurement. The reality is one of the problems is that The data that's needed is often in remote areas about vulnerable groups that are marginalized. And so it's a type of data that's not generally being pulled together in ways that is useful. I do think the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda is a real opportunity for us to try to get at that and move it forward. So I think we in the human rights community and social entrepreneurs need to really push for that type of approach to data gathering and disaggregation that will allow us to better answer some of these questions. One of the things that my office has been doing is linking up national statistical offices with national human rights institutions in places like Kenya, people who have never met each other before, and then looking at what leave no one behind, the mantra of the Sustainable Development Agenda means in that context, and what type of data and what type of groups are likely to be left behind, and how you gather that data more effectively. If we can move forward on that, it will assist us in these difficult issues of impact measurement. Unfortunately, I don't think, and in fact, when I was talking about sort of the spectrum of human rights change that's measurable, I actually, in the little diagram I made for myself, I put sort of change in cultural practice at the far end of the area where I don't have good experience in terms of how it's being done. I'm very interested to hear that you've done that sort of testing, and really looking forward to hearing more about how it works. Thank you.
Just two quick perspectives from me on your question. Vincent Benoit might have some tools that he's learned from crisis action, or maybe not. But we are, in terms of you asking what can other sectors learn from us, Crisis Action hopefully will be working with the Skoll Foundation to put out a bit of a handbook over the coming year of some evaluation tools. There is actually already a lot out there in terms of different techniques that are available to measure the impact of collective approaches. We have things like evidence of change journals that we use, so I'm very happy to talk to different people about specific methodology if that's helpful. And I think, your point, Federico, I take your point, Alex, around the politics, but I still think it's a really important point that local NGOs face, as Emily has said, very different challenges in measuring impact and communicating that impact. I think we need to recognise that for sure. And I'm so glad no one answered your question about whether we should pull Israeli civil society apart. But we'll take Emily's analogy as the answer to your question.
I'm good for this.
Thanks everyone for coming. We'll all stay here, so if you want to come down and ask us questions, but please join me in thanking everyone.